Every year, I find myself rewatching Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's a treasure trove of good storytelling, beautiful animation, stunning choreography, and satisfying character arcs. The amount of thematic depth that its 61 episodes cover is beyond impressive, and every time I go back, I can't help but fall in love with it all over again. What appeals to me most is that something about it feels real. Amidst ancient spirits, people with the power to control the elements, and flying bison, Avatar's world and the lives of the characters in it are easy to understand and connect with. This is a quality that many of the best fantasy stories have, being able to take something that out of context seems wholly unbelievable and then finding a way to make it believable. Avatar's creators, Brian Konietzko and Michael DiMartino, achieved this in the way they created and presented their world. Crafting a new world, especially one that's drastically different from reality, comes with a cavalcade of challenges, chief among which is convincing viewers to suspend their disbelief and start feeling engaged in the inner workings of the world.
Shh, I'm trying to watch.
For this to happen, the world needs to be consistent in regard to how it follows its own internal rules and logic. A story's ability to pull this off is one of the major factors that plays into if it's just okay or great, and Avatar manages this successfully in a few different ways. First off, Konietzko and DiMartino put a strong focus on creating and defining limitations early on in the show's development as a way to never let things get out of hand.
Yeah. To me, limitations are good. They allow things to happen without you going, wait a minute.
Yeah.
They didn't want to run the risk of introducing something that undermined the narrative they planned out, so they made rules that couldn't be broken. Like bending had to come from the body and only could affect nearby areas. Only the Avatar could bend more than one element. Bending is something one must be born with.
I'm an earthbender. I'm not.
And there are no magical items that give people unlimited power. These limitations made the show easy to understand while also lessening the risk of power creep, which is something that occurs when new aspects are introduced that overpower existing elements of the world, making everything feel a bit bloated and over the top. And this is something that plagues a lot of shows that center around fighting. There are certainly a few holes in the limitations the creators set for themselves, most notably with the inner workings of the spirits and Aang's abilities, but they did a solid job of not using those holes too often, which is something that the follow-up series, The Legend of Korra, kind of struggled with. At most, Avatar only ever slightly stretches its limitations, but it never breaks through them. The additions to bending and Aang's powers don't feel random or cheap, but rather a natural extension of the rules of the world. What's more is that everything in Avatar's world, whether it be clothing, culture, or infrastructure, is influenced by bending. For instance, the city of Amashu uses a combination of gravity and earthbending to transport supplies. Ba Sing Se is surrounded by a giant wall that only earthbenders could create and maintain with relative ease. The Northern Water Tribe's buildings are made of ice, and the locals use waterbending as a way to open and close the gate to their city. The air nomads built temples on high mountains that could only be easily reached by airbending, and they have a hermetic set of ideals to reflect this isolation. And the Fire Nation were the first to enter an industrial revolution of sorts because of their ability to generate power and presumably manipulate metals with their bending of fire and lightning. These details may seem small, but they establish a consistency in the world, which is what gives it that quality of feeling real. Another struggle that comes with creating a new world is making something original yet not too out there that it becomes hard for audiences to follow. Konietzko and DiMartino solved this issue by using and combining popular and easy to understand ideas instead of building everything from the ground up. Like, while there are plenty of shows that center around martial arts and many others that have characters who can manipulate various elements, none have done it with as much cohesion between the two concepts. Also, instead of populating the world with entirely made-up creatures, they simply combined real animals together, which creates interesting and humorous animals that viewers understand by just hearing the name. It might take some time to figure out what a Plimpy is in Harry Potter, but it is immediately clear what to expect from a saber-toothed moose lion. Even the show itself, which is clearly inspired by anime, is offset with jokes and ideas that are unique to being a show on Nickelodeon. Avatar is a mashup, and when looking at each of its core aspects independently, it treads a lot of familiar ground, but the fusion of all these ideas together makes it one of a kind. Now, if world building were to be split into two steps, development and presentation, all of this would fall into development. The second and maybe more difficult step is presenting the world. A writer can create the most in-depth and detailed histories, but if these things aren't presented to the audience in the right way, they won't be effective in the slightest. In fiction, the purpose of a world is to support the story being told, and Avatar achieves this by using its world to create high stakes for the main characters. A pretty common and effective approach to introducing a fictional world is having the protagonist and the audience learn about the world at the same time. For example, walking through a wardrobe and discovering a magical land, or learning about some secret innate innate power, or the often frowned upon case of amnesia. These approaches allow audiences to view the world through the same lens as the main character, which opens up the potential for explaining how the world works without it feeling out of place. Avatar slightly twists these tropes by having Aang not know anything about the current state of the world due to him being frozen for 100 years, but being extremely knowledgeable about the past. Because of this, and how the group travels to so many unfamiliar places, from a narrative standpoint, it makes sense for other characters to explain the inner workings of the modern world to Aang, as in turn, he describes to them what the past was like, ultimately showing viewers not only how the world works, but also making the world feel lived in by showing how much has changed, and in a lot of cases, how much has changed for the worse, which is important because arguably Aang's disappearance caused it all. Almost every place that Aang and company visit throughout the series is affected in some way by the same issue: war. Seeing the different ways that the war between the Fire Nation and the rest of the world has affected not only each of the 4 nations, but individual cities and towns, serves to flesh out the world and introduce backstories and histories that viewers become connected to because they see characters directly affected by events from the past. It is far easier to care about the history of a place when the effects of said history are clear and personal, and that is how Avatar presents its world, through the various people that Aang meets on his journey to master the 4 elements. During this adventure, it becomes clear how diverse yet relatable the people and places of this world are. For instance, the Earth Nation is not one uniform country. Each city's views are dependent on their experiences, which differ across the board. Some cities are under Fire Nation control, and others have barely been touched by the war. Even views from inside the same city, like Ba Sing Se, are entirely different depending on which economic level one lives in. As each city across the world is explored, a great sense of the struggle and turmoil that has been caused by the war develops. And this is so powerful because Aang blames himself for everything becoming this way. The history of Avatar's world is intertwined so tightly with the struggle of the protagonist, which makes each location's backstory tied to Aang. In turn, this makes it so for viewers, the world is actually worth saving. A lot of films and shows center around the protagonist needing to save the world, but in most cases, the only reason a viewer would care if the world is saved is because that's just how you're supposed to feel, which is boring and too easy. In Avatar, the majority of the show is spent exploring the world, giving hundreds of reasons why it is important to save. Every episode strengthens this resolve, playing into the series-long arc of defeating the Fire Lord, and because of this, no episode really feels like a filler, despite there being a handful of them that deviate far from the main plot. The show is the perfect length to tell the story that the creators intended to tell. While a part of me will always wish for more Avatar: The Last Airbender, I'm glad this installment of the story stopped where it did. Avatar's world is interesting and engaging. Konietzko and DiMartino did an excellent job of utilizing every aspect of what bending could do in a world, and it followed a consistent logic, never really stretching its rules too thin. This created a perfect backdrop to tell a fantastical yet very human story about a war-torn world filled with everything from sacrifice, suffering, and loss, to betrayal, self-examination, and redemption, to independence, wisdom, and kindness. I think I speak for most fans of the show when I say that Avatar has one of those special worlds that you dream of living in. When watching, I can escape into a different world while still being able to examine it next to my life and my struggles. And that's why I come back to it every year.